I'm Ivan Honey, the founder of the Get Happier Project, and I've been working as a psychologist and educator for the last 40 years, teaching the transformational psychology of choice theory and positive psychology in countries all around the world. I designed the Get Happier Project so children can learn the skills for well-being and mental health from a very young age, and so they have the resources to manage the challenges of their life as they grow older. The program is designed for teachers using the Get Happier materials in their schools. As you can see, it's a new and positive framework to teach and learn the skills for mental health and happiness. It's taught through stories, games and activities by a family of dragsters and their friends. Children learn the skills for resilience, for self-esteem, great relationships. They learn the skills for emotional intelligence, how to get happier, and the skills for creative problem solving. In the process, you'll develop, build and sustain a great culture within your school that keeps improving over time. So here we have some students from Moama Anglican Grammar School doing some activities. This is the grade 6 part of the program where the children are doing projects around the school to help make it a happier place. And with this program, what we've sought to do is bring together the best in practical and positive psychology and link that with effective teaching and learning processes. We've actually created a sequential and developmental program for children in the first 7 years of school and for the first 2 years of secondary school. So how did this whole thing get underway? Over the years, as I taught choice theory, as I worked with my clients, and I taught this around the world, I wondered how I could simplify it, and our first attempt was with the Cars Are Us kit, which is a set of cards which we established with Innovative Resources in Bendigo. That became a bestseller, surprisingly, for its company, and I managed to get into nearly every continent to teach it. And wherever I went, these were the questions people asked or the statements they made. Is there a way to explain choice theory, this learning process for getting happier, in a visual and simple way? Ivan, can you create something so I can teach this to my children? People were starting to see the value of it, and I wish there was something like this in schools. And the other one, I wish I'd known this when I was a child. It could have changed my life. So around about 2010, we disposed of our old psychological practice, and I started to look a little closer at how I could actually achieve what people were asking me to do. And in the process, I looked at a whole range of resources, particularly of future thinkers, educators who are looking at educating children in the 21st century, what we need to be able to learn in order to be effective. This is a great little book by Daniel Pink, A Whole New Mind, Why Right-Brainers Will Rule the Future. Now, traditionally, the left brain's associated with the logical, systematic part of the brain, whereas the right brain is more the creative part. And again, we need both. But Daniel Pink makes some compelling arguments for why having these skills are going to make the real difference for our children surviving in the future. So when we're on our right brain, we're looking for meaning, we're tapping into creativity and inventiveness. We're looking for fun, we're looking for joy, we're able to tap into our empathy. And so he talks a bit about how we can do this in his book, and the next part he uses is to explain the changes that have happened since we came down from the trees, and we learned how to dig the soil, to till crops, and because of that we could create villages and towns and cities because the food was readily available. And then as time went on, we learned to dig in the ground, to mine the ores, get the metals out, fabricate them, and create larger buildings, larger cities, skyscrapers. Then we enter the information age, and we're still right in the middle of this, and who knows when it's going to end. Because now we have so much information about everything in the world. We tap into Dr. Google, we can find out all about what's wrong with us. We can discover anything we want on YouTube. I have grandchildren, and I'm sure a lot of their learning takes place on YouTube, where they look at how people do things, and they learn so quickly this way. But the big question for us now, I think, is how do we use this information in constructive ways to get happier, to help make the world a more effective and happier place? And this is where Daniel Pink talks about getting onto the right side of the brain, where we're able to put those chunks of information into structures which are going to create more happiness and well-being in the world. And for this we need to get really creative. We need to invent and reinvent things in different ways in order to achieve these outcomes. So Daniel Pink would go on to say something like this: the future will belong to these children who've learned to think laterally, flexibly and creatively. They've worked out how to solve problems without conflicting too much with other people. They understand themselves, they manage their feelings effectively, they build their relationships and self-esteem successfully, they choose inspiring, positive and optimistic lives and get happier, even in the face of adversity. And there are many people who would argue in schools we're really on just about teaching children the 3 R's and teaching them the academic skills. But as Daniel Pink points out, unless children have this broader and more positive and optimistic problem-solving mindset, it doesn't matter how much you know. These are the key skills if we want to survive in a world that's changing so rapidly that in many areas what we learnt yesterday is already out of date today. So another person who's been very significant in psychology over the last 30 or 40 years is Daniel Goleman, and he came up with the words emotional intelligence to describe that ability that we need to have in order to understand and manage our feelings effectively, because we know that when we're not able to do that, we don't learn so well. As he points out very clearly, you need a good level of emotional intelligence to actually learn well and do the jobs required of you to achieve successful outcomes in your learning. The research is clear. Children with high emotional intelligence actually learn quicker, better, more successfully. And as he says, if we cannot manage our emotions, we cannot be in charge of our lives. And higher levels of emotional intelligence correlate directly with life success, life satisfaction and academic success. And right across the world now, education systems are starting to realise this. And when we had James Merlino, the Minister for Education, visit one of our Get Happier schools, he wrote back to me and talked about it in this way. He said, the Get Happier project aligns with one of the key Victorian government commitments for the education state, which is to ensure the overall well-being of children and young people is as high a priority as literacy and numeracy. And this reflects an understanding of emotional intelligence that schools and education systems are realising without the ability to cope emotionally in this world, we're pretty much wasting our time simply focusing on literacy and numeracy. It's equally important. So what are the challenges that have led to this understanding? This is the first one for most teachers here. You'll realise this, that at least 1 in 4 young people have experienced a mental disorder in the past 12 months. So that's saying there's a number of children in our classrooms who are preoccupied with their own well-being to a point where they're not able to learn effectively, and they're suffering some sort of emotional distress. The next one, I'm sure you'll know too, that 4 in 10 teachers report very high levels of occupational stress. I was talking about this in a school recently, and someone put their hand up and said, Ivan, that's wrong. I said, so what are the figures? And they said to me, in this school it's more like 8 in 10. Because let's face it, things have moved along so quickly and teachers have had to accommodate so much more in their role that it's a very tough place to be. In one school I know, most of the staff are actually working part-time because they can't sustain full-time work with the expectations that requires. Next, up to 80% of parents in Western countries still believe and practice the act of smacking their children. And unfortunately, that leads to these sorts of outcomes where family violence is the biggest killer of women aged 14 to 44 in Australia, double this figure for Aboriginal women. And even governments are realising very strongly now that domestic violence and these sorts of issues are pretty much at epidemic levels, and they're doing everything they can to try and deal with it. But you see, when children get used to parents solving problems through violence, they come to believe quite naturally that's the way you do it. If you're bigger and stronger than someone else, you have a right to force your demands on another person through violence. And again, that models the process that we see replicated over and over again. I won't spend too much time on this, but we all know this. And here's Professor Alan Fels, Chairman of the Mental Health Commission. And here it is, over half of all Australians will experience a serious mental illness during their lifetime. We know that there are vast numbers of people dying every day through suicide. Many of my clients are seeing me for these sorts of reasons. And as Professor Fels pointed out, the cost is massive in terms of money, but it's also massive in terms of the weight of human suffering that we see around us that people are experiencing. So it's becoming very clear that we need to do something about this, but unfortunately mental health systems are overloaded. There's a great big survey going on here in Victoria at the moment to look at this because people are concerned mental health is not working so well. And this is partly because traditionally there's been a focus on alleviating suffering, which is great. It's like I'm part of that system myself. But there's a growing recognition of the need to support people to stay mentally well and to focus on early intervention. And for all these organisations, peak organisations around the world, they are saying prevention is a key priority. We simply don't have the resources to deal reactively with issues that arise, which really brings us to the difference between mental illness and mental health. And it's often defined this way. Mental illness is defined by the painful emotional symptoms people experience using diagnostic criteria. So we look at everything that's going wrong, the pathology, and from this efforts are made to treat and alleviate symptoms. On the right-hand side of this, you'll see one of the cards from our card set. We'll talk more about those in another session. Now, in contrast, mental health is not simply the absence of mental illness. It is a state of emotional well-being that allows us to achieve our potential and live our lives to the full, even in the face of adversity. So as you're seeing, we're looking at two quite different concepts here. And that's why we focus more on mental health. A focus on mental health and well-being is actually the most powerful antidote for mental ill health. If you're happy, if you have these skills, these are powerful protective factors in terms of avoiding those negative mental illness issues which, as we say, are at epidemic proportion, not only in Australia but around the world. And so learning these skills for self-esteem, resilience, problem-solving and emotional intelligence is one of the best protective factors against mental ill health. Let's have a look at some of the world figures who talk about happiness and see what they say about this. How do we go about conveying this to our population? It's a big issue. Here we have the Dalai Lama, who's sort of the guru of happiness, isn't he, in our culture? He says, I have a dream that the world will become a really happy human family. And how will it happen? Through education, by teaching holistic and realistic thinking. Through this we can develop a oneness of humanity. Here we have Dr. Glasser, the founder of choice theory and reality therapy. You know, one of my key mentors in terms of my training and ongoing work. And he says, yeah, therapy is good, but we've got to go beyond therapy and focus on prevention by teaching people choice theory, an understanding of how they behave, how they can manage and understand their feelings and get happier. It is teaching, not treatment, and it can be taught to both students and teachers. And often I think, you know, it's a bit like playing a game. We expect people to play the game of life without teaching them the rules. It's a bit like sitting down for a game of Monopoly and saying, well, off you go, everyone, but we're not going to tell you the rules. And as we know, there'll be conflict, there'll be confusion, people will get sad and unhappy. So the Get Happier project was designed to teach the guidelines. We're not telling you exactly how to do it, but to give you the framework for how you can live the most happy, contented and responsible life you can. So the next question was for us, how do we package these guidelines to teach children the skills for resilience, mental health, responsibility, happiness and self-esteem? And it became very clear that we need to use a very simple, visual, fun and practical mental model for getting happier. And here, as you see, I've just returned from Singapore working with a group of teachers, and there is our mental model. It's a floor mat. Some schools use it as a flag, which has powerful visual representations of each component of mental health that we can use at any time to self-evaluate, to teach, to manage our well-being in the most effective way. So we use this particular mental model, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a moment, because we go to Dr. Pamela Rutledge and she says, how do we think? We think in terms of stories. In fact, we go back to our ancestors, you know, who are living in caves and trying to cope with the challenges of just surviving in the face of saber-toothed tigers. And they find successful ways of managing these creatures with fire and a whole range of other weapons. And so the stories are passed on to the next generation. Interesting stories of adventure and fun and how people have succeeded in surviving. And they're passed down in an oral tradition in tribes through stories. And it's very much the same today, whether it's a movie, whether it's a story, whatever. But these are how we make meaning of life, she would say. And we call them all sorts of different names: schemas, scripts, cognitive maps, mental models, metaphors, or narratives. It's how we make decisions, persuade others, understand our place in the world, create our identities, and define and teach social values. So let's move on to the Get Happier project, because here we talk about the concept of life as a journey and ourselves as travellers. And it's a universally understood aspect of human experiences, the idea that we're on a journey. We start at birth and continue through to our death. During this period of time, we're on a journey of self-awareness, self-discovery, learning how to make a difference in the world and feeling good about ourselves. So this metaphor, the idea of life as a journey, is the mental model behind the Get Happier School. And here it is, the Get Happier Project roadmap. And so we use maps, roads, dragsters and stories to set the scene for a journey of discovery and adventure. So the basic principle of the Get Happier project is this: every human being is driven by the desire to get happier. Getting miserable is something we try to avoid. But then there's the big questions. What do we mean by get happier? Everyone has their own definitions. What is happiness? And how do we get happier? What actions are going to work best for us? I'm going to throw up a slide now which comes from the Get Happier toolbox. What do we mean by get happier? And again, this looks a bit like the hero's journey idea, this widespread idea to be happy. We should have this perfectly happy life and enjoy positive emotions all the time. And I must admit, I used to think this. Maybe there is a way one can be happy all the time. But in trying to do that, when you find that you're not getting happier, then you start to get a bit miserable, and then you might just start to blame yourself and think, well, I'm not too good, I can't be happy all the time. And once I started to understand this is a pretty unrealistic ideal, I could manage that situation a lot better. I was able to give up trying to be perfectly happy all the time. And that gave me a lot of energy to focus more on creating a more satisfying life, identifying my highest values, and following all those things which I love to do. So to get happier, we get real with our thinking, we work out what we really want and take action to achieve our goals. The other aspect of this is, because we are going to have challenges in life, our happiness will depend on our ability and how we've learned to deal with our painful feelings and return to our lives wiser and stronger rather than demoralised and discouraged. So therefore we use the words get happier to describe how we feel when we have the skills and mindsets for resilience, self-esteem, mental health and emotional intelligence. A few quotes from some well-known people. Jackson Browne, he was a singer back in the 60s or 70s. I love what he says here. Happiness is not the absence of problems, but the ability to deal with them. In other words, if we have some skills and some frameworks to deal with our problems, we can walk confidently through our lives knowing we have the skills to cope with whatever life throws at us. And it's that confidence, he would say, which defines our capacity to feel happy. An amazing person, Nelson Mandela, who, look what he says after 27 years in prison. Very cruel treatment. He says, I am what I am, both as a result of people who respected me and helped me, and of those who did not respect me and treated me badly. So see, he was able to learn and grow from those experiences rather than becoming bitter and twisted and cynical and angry. This is an amazing man, as we know. One of the other quotes, he says, education, he says, is the great engine that drives growth and development in a country. And so to know what we want to teach ourselves and our children, and the most basic thing is to get happier, is absolutely so critical for our well-being. And here we have Martin Seligman, who's known as the father of positive psychology. And Martin realised early in his life that a lot of psychology was pretty much all about misery and pathology and all the things that could go wrong. And so he created this area of positive psychology, which fits beautifully into what we're talking about today. And he defines happiness. He used the word life satisfaction. And he says, well, it's all about positive emotion. You know, you spend some time working out how to make yourself feel happier, doing the things that you love to do, being with the people who help you feel good and so on. Is number one. Number two, he talks about engagement, fully engaged with your life, with your work, doing stuff that you love to do. And when we're fully engaged, time actually seems to compress.
When we're doing something we don't like, time seems to expand. It just seems to take all day to get to the end of the day. But when we're fully engaged in what we do, that's when we feel that sense of happiness, of satisfaction. We get to the end of the day and think, where did it all go to? It's been so interesting, so much fun. And then finally, he says, if you can link that to some sort of meaning and some sort of higher purpose in your life, that's what also gives you that sense of deep satisfaction. He has this nice little acronym, PERMA, which looks at those 5 aspects of getting happier. First, the positive emotion, the engagement we've talked about, relationships. If you've got the skills for getting on well with people, you're going to be so much happier. You link to some meaning, some purpose, and then you're able to achieve certain significant outcomes for you. That's when you put all this together and you're likely to experience higher levels of life satisfaction. So the next question, how do we teach children to get happier? And this is where the whole Get Happier project and the Get Happier School emerged. And these are some of the books and resources that we've created over the last 8 to 10 years to help teachers, to help students, to help parents understand how to do this, I guess in a way that is common right across the board for teachers, for students and parents. We use exactly the same fundamental model, but use different resources depending on the age and developmental level of those children or parents. What we found was that teachers started to get hold of these products. They loved them and they wanted more. And they asked me for more sequential learning guides and resources for the whole school, because what they identified was these resources made a difference in 1 or 2 classes, but then the impact of that would dissipate because there wasn't any ongoing processes. And so to support every teacher and school, we developed the Get Happier School. Here I am again at Moama Anglican Grammar, and here's a couple of students who've created another fantastic mural using the images of the Get Happier School. And it's hard to be miserable in a place like this when you're reminded constantly you've got a choice. You can be miserable or you can be happy, and these are the roads you can use in order to get happier. So the whole idea of a whole school approach was very appealing to me, because we know, and the research is clear on this. Here's Professor Brian Caldwell saying, a whole school approach is vital for developing and implementing programs for the mental health of students. One of the problems in schools and school systems is that we tend to do things in isolation, when in fact everything is connected. So that whole school program is essential, to keep transforming and renewing that positive culture, manage problems effectively, deal with some of those challenges like bullying, reducing stress, improving learning and well-being. And in the process, everyone in the school learns and practices choice theory, and indeed a whole range of other effective cognitive approaches to well-being. And of course mindfulness, which is a key part of what we teach as well. So what's it look like? Let's have a look at this. It needs to be comprehensive, it needs to be integrated, it's got to make sense, cover the key learning aspects of what we've been talking about, and having this mental model also that enables recall, and so people can understand it and apply it easily. It needs simple structures and systems, because they're always stronger and more durable than complex systems. And if it's going to be a genuine social and emotional learning program, it must connect with current research and curriculum requirements. Looking at this whole school approach, it's really understanding the school as a complex system, because as I see it, there are 2 ways of looking at a problem. We can have the quick fix approach, which focuses on symptoms, and then we use trial and error or quick fixes. We have an anti-bullying day, or we do something, we bring in a new discipline or behaviour management program, and unfortunately we've discovered that the outcomes, they do improve temporarily, but then they go back because we haven't dealt with the underlying causes, the issues. And so when we're looking at a planned whole school approach, we're looking at the causes, the underlying issues that are actually creating the symptoms which come to the surface, and we notice so much more. But we look back at our system and see how functional that is. We look at the mindsets, the unmet needs. If people are unhappy, that's when they're likely to do things which are pretty dysfunctional. If they don't have the knowledge or skill to manage themselves or solve problems, obviously they can't do it. And so by teaching these things and creating a different process here, we get sustainable outcomes which last. It's a bit like I'm driving along in the car and I see a red light come on the dash, and it's the temperature light saying my engine's overheating. Now that's what I see as the symptom, a flashing red light. So if we use the Band-Aid approach, I just put a Band-Aid over the red light and it's disappeared. This is all good, I keep driving. But of course we know over time the engine will continue to overheat and the engine will disintegrate. It's going to blow up on me. On the other hand, if we understand the flashing red light as a symptom and we say, yes, this must mean there's something happening, I'm running out of water or whatever it might be, I'm then able to deal with the cause, and then the red light goes out. See, this is such a key idea, I think. To understand this is really the heart of understanding how we improve our school, our learning, our happiness. Again, the quick fix approach is often used, as we said before, with drug use. The whole idea, I'm feeling sad, let's just take a pill, have a few more beers or a few more wines in order to feel a bit better. And probably they do give some temporary relief from the stress we're feeling. But if that's the only thing we're doing, we're not really discovering any long-term, effective, sustainable way to feel better. And all we find ourselves doing is becoming addicted to that particular substance. So, after all that, let's have a look at the Get Happier School. So what do we teach? We teach a very practical, evidence-based psychology of happiness, high performance and well-being. And here's a classroom of students in a school in Slovenia in Europe, if you can read that Slovenian language, and they're playing a game using some of the Get Happier materials. So again, it's saying we teach it through stories, through fun activities, visual cues, real life discovery learning practices. People love to learn this because it is very interesting, and here we are at a boxing gym in Darwin with our great friend Mercedes Tafe. She's an ex-champion boxer herself, and these boys, young people, they just love to learn this because they know to manage their emotions, to understand their behaviour is going to give them the edge in competitive boxing. Instead of reacting to, things that happen to you, you have the skills to maintain a balanced, a mindful approach, to keep focused on your task, to deal with those feelings in the most effective way. And we've had great outcomes with these young people. The next question, when is the optimal time to teach it? And of course, we teach this whenever we can at any life stage, but for maximum effect, it's great to teach it before puberty because, as we know, young people at that stage are so open to learning these ideas. Next question, why is it detailed, sequential and developmental? Why do we need this? And we know that for any learning to be effective, those of us who are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy and recognising there is a sequence, to understanding things, to learning them, to practicing them, and then to actually applying them in different contexts, is actually the heart of effective learning. And we tap into higher order thinking processes to consolidate learning and practice right from when children start school right to year 8. What does the Get Happier School look like? So it's about novelty, creativity, whole brain thinking. The whole curriculum is really taught by the Dragsters and the Ministry of Cars, using the principles of discovery learning and questioning and self-evaluating facilitates that meaningful learning and openness, curiosity and engagement. It's developmental, it's systematically applied across the school, the beginning right through to grade 6. Teachers are supported every step of the way, and this is the aspect I love. It keeps giving back to the school as the materials are creatively reinterpreted by grade 6 students, where they create their own unique projects to increase happiness within the school and at the same time develop the skills of project management.